I had always believed my family to be the unshakable fortress that would shield me from every storm. Yet I was forced through bitter experience to learn that the cruellest betrayals are so often plotted not by strangers at the gates, but by those you welcomed through them, behind the very walls you trusted most.
Since the dark day I laid my late husband Edward to rest, I had lived all alone in this great house, surrounded only by walls heavy with memories. Day after day passed in monotonous silence, and the weekend visits from my dear daughter Alice and her charming husband Richard had become the brightest moments that gave life to my quiet existence. Richard, in particular, was unfailingly courteous and sweet-tongued. Each time he arrived, there he would be at the door with a bunch of my favorite daisies, his warm smile never leaving his face. He would stoop to take off my shoes at the threshold, sit with me for hours listening to my old stories without complaint, and carry himself as though he were the most devoted son-in-law in the world. It was during one such cheerful supper that Richard, almost casually, remarked on how large the house was, how difficult it must be to maintain and keep clean on my own, and how much more sensible it might be, in time, for me to move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier, without the burden of tending a garden. That night, for the very first time, an unnamed unease began to stir within me. Lying in bed afterwards, I could not rid my mind of Richard's seemingly innocent words. Though I fancied myself a fair judge of character after so many years, I could not understand why this man, so wholly trusted by my daughter, should spark such inexplicable doubt in me. Yet I knew, deep down, that I must discover the truth. In the days that followed, as those troubling words echoed again and again in my mind, part of me tried to dismiss it as the fanciful worry of age. Yet another part recalled Edward's old warning, always trust your instincts. Between these two voices, I found myself torn and uncertain of my next step. From then on, each of their visits became an exercise in quiet observation. I scrutinized Richard's every glance, every remark, no longer seeing pure courtesy, but searching for hidden motives. I noticed how his eyes lingered on the silverware in the sitting room, on Edward's old pocket watch, the faint glint that crossed his gaze each time. Even his seemingly harmless questions about household finances, dropped into the conversation with such ease, began to feel like pieces of a puzzle I could not yet see in full. Yet I could say nothing, not a word to Alice, my beloved daughter. To do so would be to wound her, to pit her against her husband. In that silence, I felt utterly helpless. Then one night, while watching an old film, a simple idea struck me. A tiny device, almost invisible, that might offer me the one thing I lacked: proof. Proof that could tell me whether my suspicions were mere paranoia, or whether the truth was indeed as dark as I feared. When I phoned my grandson Oliver, a bright young man studying computer science at university, I did not tell him that I suspected his uncle. Instead, I crafted a careful little lie. I said that, as an elderly woman living alone, I would feel safer with some protection against the repairmen or cleaners who came and went. With this innocent pretext, I asked if he could find me a small security camera, something discreet, something no one would notice. A few days later, When the parcel arrived and that tiny piece of technology sat cold and gleaming in the palm of my hand, I felt not only curiosity, but also fear, for in that moment, I understood that by installing it, I risked shattering my family's fragile peace forever. Yet stronger than that fear was the heavy weight of responsibility, the need to learn the truth, however painful it might be.
For days I turned that tiny device over and over in my hand, knowing I had to place it in the sitting room where the most telling conversations took place, yet also faced with the challenge of concealing it inside something so ordinary that Richard would never suspect it. I scanned the room in my mind 100 times, searching for the perfect hiding place. At last, my thoughts returned to the carved wooden clock that had belonged to my late husband Edward. It had long since stopped working, but I kept it on the mantelpiece for its sentimental value. The moment I thought of using it, I felt torn, racked with guilt at turning one of my most sacred keepsakes into a tool for unmasking betrayal, yet oddly reassured, knowing it was the one object Richard would never dare to touch out of respect. With trembling fingers, I pried open the small hollow at the back of the clock, my heart pounding as though any knock at the door or passing shadow at the window might expose me. Every sound from the street outside made my blood run cold. It felt like a race against time to finish this operation unseen. When the little lens finally clicked into place, becoming the silent witness of the room, the house I had once thought of as my fortress of peace was transformed into a stage of secrets. The mantel clock, once an innocent ornament, now stood as a hidden executioner, its frozen hands marking the uneasy wait for truth. When my daughter Alice rang with her usual cheerful voice, saying, "Mom, Richard and I will be over tomorrow," my heart thudded so violently I thought it might burst. Knowing I was about to face the hardest test of my life, I fought with all my strength to disguise the tremor in my voice and answered with the same familiar warmth, "I'll be waiting, my darling." On the day of their visit, I drifted through the house like a ghost from the first light of morning. Time seemed to refuse to move, and with every passing car my heart leapt into my throat. The unbearable tension grew heavier as the moment of reckoning drew nearer, wearing down my nerves with each tick of the clock. When the doorbell finally rang, its chime seemed to freeze everything around me. For one wild instant, I wanted to stop time altogether, to leave the door unopened, to remain forever in the uncertain comfort of suspicion, rather than confront the bitter truth. But I knew there was no turning back. Fate had already set its snare, and I was caught within it. I arranged the most convincing smile I could muster and opened the door. Richard embraced me with even more warmth and courtesy than usual, a gesture that fed the faintest flicker of hope in me that perhaps I was wrong about him. Yet at the same time, that very false tenderness twisted my stomach with pain, reminding me of the truth I feared lay beneath. As we sat together in the sitting room, now a stage in my private theater, I could hardly bear the knowledge that every word, every glance, every laugh was being captured by that silent eye above the mantel. In my own home, I was both victim and director of this tragic play. Seizing on the first excuse that came to mind, I told Alice I had forgotten to refill a jar with her favorite cherry preserve. Rising to fetch it from the kitchen, every step away from the room filled me with an almost unbearable urge to block my ears, to shield myself from the conversation I knew would soon unfold between them, words that might change the course of my life forever.
In the little storeroom I used as a pantry, I stood for minutes, clutching that meaningless jar of cherry preserve, straining to make out the muffled voices drifting from the sitting room. Every pause, every whisper twisted in my mind into scenes of catastrophe. In those torturous moments, I felt both close to and painfully far from learning the outcome of the trap I myself had set. Then it came, the sudden rise of Richard's voice, sharp and domineering, unlike his usual careful tones, echoing through the walls and striking me like a blow. Almost at once, I heard my dear Alice's broken sobs. Every motherly instinct in me longed to drop everything and rush to her side, to shield her from whatever had wounded her. Yet the cold chains of reason held me fast. If this game was to end, I had to remain composed. When at last I returned to the sitting room, jar in hand, the air was thick with silence. The cheerful chatter had evaporated, leaving only Alice's red, tear-stained eyes and Richard's strained attempt at calm composure. In that instant, I knew the conversation behind my back had been no innocent exchange, but the placing of dynamite at the very foundations of my family. The remainder of the visit dragged on like an endless charade. We all sat together, words hovering unspoken, each of us wearing masks. I performed the part of the blissfully ignorant grandmother, while inside I was pleading for them to leave, to free me so I could face the darkness on my own terms. At last, when the door closed behind them and I stripped the false smile from my face, my legs shook as if I had run a marathon. I lunged towards the mantelpiece, pulled out the tiny spy hidden inside Edward's old clock, and held it in my palm. It was no longer just a camera. It was the vessel of truth, ready to either confirm my worst fears or prove me nothing more than a foolish old woman. I dragged out my dusty old computer, unused for years, and tried to follow Oliver's carefully explained steps. My fingers trembled all the more as I realized this cold, modern device stood between me and the bitterest truth of my life. At last, I found the right file and pressed play. A strange chill crept over me as I watched my own sitting room through another's eyes. The moment I had stepped out, Richard's gentle mask slipped away, replaced by a calculating, icy expression. I froze. Then came the words, poisoned words, of my son-in-law. I heard him pressing Alice to convince me to sell my beloved home, not for my comfort, but to rescue himself from a disastrous business deal. Cloaking his greed with lies about my well-being, he twisted my daughter's conscience, wielding manipulation like a surgeon's knife. The most painful part of all was hearing Alice. At first, she resisted fiercely, refusing to part with the house her father Edward had left us. But as Richard laced his pressure with honeyed phrases like, "I'm only thinking of our future," and "It's for you and the children we'll have one day," her strength faltered. She fell silent, her spirit crushed into reluctant submission. When the screen finally darkened,
I sat in silence, hearing only the shattering of my own heart. And in that moment, I understood. This betrayal was not about bricks, mortar, or money. It was about love and trust, those deepest treasures of the soul being stabbed in the back by those I cherished most. And I knew then that the knife must be taken from their hands and justice delivered by mine.
As I sat for hours in that cold little room, not knowing how the time had passed, the first shock of what I had seen slowly ebbed away. In its place came a deep, icy disappointment, colder and more piercing than anything I had ever known. The happy family portrait I had built in my mind over years of love and trust now lay shattered into pieces. The following day, I wandered through the house like a ghost. Every photograph on the wall, every cushion on the sofa seemed now tainted by deceit. When I looked at the wedding portrait of Alice and Richard, I could see it clearly for the first time. Behind that dazzling smile of his, there had always been calculation and cold ambition. As I trimmed the dead branches from the roses in the garden, I felt my grief slowly pruned away, replaced by a sharp and unyielding anger. It was an anger that stripped away illusions and left me with a clarity I had never possessed before. I realized that in their eyes, I was nothing more than a gullible old woman, easily deceived. And if I was to win this cruel game, I would have to play exactly that part. I understood then that confronting Richard directly would achieve nothing. It would only drag Alice into the middle and give him yet another chance to spin his lies. In that moment, the thought struck me like lightning. The only way to destroy their treachery was to act exactly as they wished, playing the part of the naive widow ready to sell her home while secretly writing the final act of this play myself. Knowing I could not walk this dangerous road alone, I sought out the number of Mr. Harris, my late husband Edward's closest friend and confidant, a retired barrister whose wisdom and integrity I had always respected, even though we had not spoken in years. As I dialed his number, I felt for the first time that I was taking back control of my fate, that this war had truly begun. When I heard his steady, paternal voice on the line, my throat tightened, but I quickly gathered myself. I told him, in a few carefully chosen words, how serious the situation was, and how vital it was that we meet face to face. His immediate, unquestioning agreement to see me the next day lifted some of the crushing weight from my shoulders. We chose not to meet in a cold office, but instead at the quiet tea garden beneath the ancient oaks where Edward and I had often gone in years past. The moment I looked into his wise, weathered eyes that still sparkled with intellect despite the toll of years, I knew I had made the right choice. Here was the only man I could trust with my secret. For long minutes I spoke without pause, from my first suspicions to the damning video itself, sometimes with my voice shaking, sometimes swallowing down my anger. He never interrupted me once. He listened as if he could feel the betrayal to his late friend's family in his very own heart. His silent empathy eased my pain more than I could have imagined. When at last I fell silent, it was Mr. Harris who broke the heavy air. He began not with legal jargon, but with kind words of sympathy, assuring me how sorry he was for what I had endured. Then, gently but firmly, he told me that while my plan was clever, it would also be dangerous and exhausting. Yet he promised me he would stand by me, not just as a barrister, but as a friend, until the very end. At that table, we laid the first stones of the plan that would entrap Richard in his own greed.
mock visits to estate agents, draft agreements with no legal standing, but every appearance of formality and precise instructions on how I was to play the part of the simple, trusting widow ready to sell her home. When I finally rose from that meeting, I was no longer a grieving victim. I was a commander with a map in her hands, marching towards victory.
The hardest and most excruciating part of our plan was the moment I had to pick up the phone, hear my daughter's innocent voice saying, "Mom," without the faintest suspicion, and tell her the crushing lie I had rehearsed for days, that I had thought it all over and decided that Richard was right. Each word cut into me like a knife, but I forced myself to deliver it with the tone of a beaten, weary old woman. In my daughter's voice, I could hear the strange mixture of guilt and relief, a bittersweet joy that the pressure was finally over. But then Richard snatched the phone from her hand, and in that falsely tender tone of his, carefully concealing his triumph, he thanked me and said he would see to the sale of the house at once. That was the moment I knew beyond doubt the plan was working, and I was no longer the prey, but the hunter. When Mr. Harris's trusted associate, the so-called estate agent, arrived with his files, speaking of inflated valuations and figures plucked from thin air, I watched Richard carefully. He bowed and scraped in front of this professional, his eyes widening with greed at every mention of a higher sum. It was as if I could see him through the hidden eye of the clock above the mantelpiece, caught red-handed by the very trap he had underestimated. As we had predicted, Richard seized control as though the house were already his inheritance. He questioned the commission rates, debated the technicalities of the sale process, and spoke over both me and Alice, reducing us to mere spectators in our own home, while he strutted about as if he were a country gentleman selling his ancestral estate. Once the false agent had gone, Richard, drunk on his supposed victory, embraced Alice and spoke with giddy excitement about paying off his debts, starting a new business, and how wealthy they would soon become. All the while I sat silently, playing the part of the frail mother who had just sacrificed her beloved home, when in reality, I was simply letting him walk step by step towards his ruin. A week after that staged visit, Richard's mask of politeness began to slip. He phoned me daily, his tone increasingly impatient and accusatory, demanding to know why this supposed buyer had not yet made an offer. Each time I feigned ignorance, the picture of a helpless old woman, while secretly savoring his growing desperation and greed. At last, as Mr. Harris and I had planned, the agent reappeared, holding an official-looking letter, an irresistible bait. It contained a fictitious offer, far above the true value of the house, from an imaginary buyer. When Richard snatched it from my hands and saw the figure, his reason evaporated. He urged me to accept immediately, crying out, "Don't even think about it. Sign at once." His blindness to the trap we had laid could not have been clearer. At that precise moment, I produced the document Mr. Harris had so carefully prepared, a limited power of attorney that gave Richard only authority to liaise with this fictitious buyer, but no right to sell, no right to collect money. Placing it on the table, I said with my most convincing air of defeat, "I don't understand these official matters. Best you handle it all for me." Blinded by his dream of millions,
Richard never paused to read the fine print. With a wide smile, he scrolled his signature and left the house, utterly convinced he held the key to a fortune. In truth, what he had signed was not a gateway to wealth, but a document that would serve as damning evidence of his fraudulent intent. I let him leave, basking in the glow of his false triumph, unaware that the darkness was already closing in around him. From the moment Richard signed that fraudulent power of attorney, all his false courtesy vanished. He no longer called me with polite greetings, but only to deliver short, curt updates about his supposed negotiations with the imaginary buyer. He treated me not as his wife's mother, but as a mere business partner whose signature he needed, an outsider to be used and discarded. It was then I saw with painful clarity just how far he had fallen. What tore me apart most during that time was not Richard's arrogance, but my daughter Alice's feeding spirit. Each time she phoned, her voice trembled with guilt, worn down by her husband's relentless greed. And to comfort her, I was forced to utter those poisonous lies. "It's all for our good, my dear," words that stabbed me with every syllable, for they were the very opposite of truth. At last, the call I had been waiting for came from Mr. Harris. He told me that a private meeting room had been arranged in one of London's largest banks, and that Richard had been summoned there to sign the final papers with the fictitious buyer's solicitors. I knew then that the net I had been weaving for months was ready to close. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered through every room of my house, the home where I had gathered a lifetime of memories with my late husband. I touched the walls in silence, knowing that after tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same, and the innocence of this place would be lost forever. Though Richard had dragged my daughter into this as his pawn, I decided Alice must witness the truth with her own eyes. So I telephoned her once more, speaking in a voice so soft and pleading she could not refuse, and told her how important it was for me to have her by my side for the signing. In that way, I invited her to the final act of our play. The next day, in the polished oak and leather-scented meeting room of the bank, Alice tried to mask her nerves with a smile. "Mom, it's all so formal here." Opposite us sat Mr. Harris and the stern-faced barristers he had carefully chosen for this last scene. We waited in the heavy silence that always comes before a storm. Then the door opened, and Richard swept in with the swagger of a man convinced he was about to secure the triumph of his life. His face flickered with surprise, even unease, when he saw Alice seated at the table. Yet the intoxication of the fortune he believed awaited him quickly drowned that flicker, and he sat down at the head of the table as if already master of it all. Mr. Harris slid the paper across the table, a fake sales contract of no legal weight. Richard barely glanced at the words before seizing the pen and signing with eager strokes. At that moment, Mr. Harris cleared his throat, shed his friendly manner, and in measured, judicial tones began to speak of the obvious abuse of the limited power of attorney Richard had been granted. The atmosphere in the room froze. Richard's protest, "What's the meaning of this?" died in his throat, when a small screen was placed on the table, and then he heard it, his own voice, echoing through the room, captured in my sitting room, pressuring Alice to force me out of my home, boasting of his debts and plotting to strip me of everything I held dear. When the recording ended, silence fell like a shroud. It was broken first by Alice's sob, raw with betrayal, and then by the sight of Richard himself, pale as chalk, tongue-tied, the mask torn away, crushed beneath the ruins of his own deceit. And then I understood. Justice does not always roar in courtrooms. Sometimes it comes with the silent, unbearable weight of truth.
In that moment, as everyone in the room held their breath, my daughter rose to her feet without so much as glancing at her husband. Shaken to her very core by the weight of betrayal and heartbreak, she clung to my arm as though I were the only safe harbor left in the world. It was a gesture that words could never capture, yet it marked the beginning of an ending beyond measure. As we turned to leave that ruined scene, it was Mr. Harris's calm yet steely voice that cut through the air, informing Richard, still frozen at the table like a statue, that the forged documents he had signed and the video evidence of his intent constituted attempted fraud, and that immediate legal proceedings would follow. At last, the cold, sharp face of justice revealed itself, stepping out from the bank's sterile, fluorescent-lit halls into the bright afternoon sun and the bustling crowds of London, people going about their lives oblivious to our storm. I felt with greater clarity than ever that what I had won was no triumph. It was a bitter victory. My daughter's hopes and dreams lay buried in the rubble of her marriage. On the journey home, the car was filled only with Alice's quiet sobs. Minute after minute dragged by as I wrestled with the helplessness of having no words that could soothe her. I thought bitterly of the cruel irony that in trying to protect her, I had led her straight into the greatest pain of her life, forcing her to stare betrayal in the face. When we finally walked back through the door of the house that had once been our haven, Alice's eyes fell on the sitting room. To me, every piece of furniture, every familiar object had been turned into an accomplice in Richard's deceit. Her gaze lingered longest on the innocent-looking wooden clock above the fireplace, our silent witness. To her, this home was no longer a refuge, but the crime scene of her shattered trust. In the days that followed, our home became a place where words failed, replaced only by sobs and the sound of heavy breathing. I gave Alice space to grieve in her own way. Instead of pushing her to talk, I offered my love silently through a steaming bowl of soup left at her door or a shawl draped across her shoulders at night. It was an evening later when the silence finally broke. Alice came to me, her voice trembling. How could I not see? How did I believe him? What followed was hours of weeping, pouring out her anger at herself, her humiliation, her disbelief. I held her tightly, saying nothing, letting her cry until the poison of his lies had left her. When at last she found the strength to speak, I told her everything. How my suspicions had begun, how I planted the hidden camera, and how Mr. Harris and I wove this dangerous game.
I made her understand that it had never been to hurt her, but to save her before her life was utterly destroyed. Her only mistake, I told her, was the most innocent act of all, to love and to trust. Not long after, Mr. Harris telephoned again. Despite every attempt by Richard's family to intervene, charges of attempted fraud had been formally filed, and the divorce proceedings on Alice's behalf were underway. When Alice received this news, she did not cry. She simply nodded, her face weary but resolved. It was the first sign she was beginning to rise from the rubble. Weeks later, as we stood together beneath the old fig tree in the garden, turning the soil with our hands, she looked at me. Though her eyes still carried shadows of sorrow, for the first time in months, a genuine smile touched her lips. And in that smile, I saw proof that even the deepest wounds can scar over with time and love, that from ruins, the smallest of flowers can grow again.
As the months passed and the seasons shifted one after another, the wounded walls of our home slowly became a safe harbor. With Alice beside me, we built a new, quiet routine, tending to each other's scars with patience, laying a thin veil of peace over memories once soaked in pain. Watching my daughter not only return to the career Richard had once forced her to abandon, but also stand on her own 2 feet with greater strength than ever before, filled me with pride. Each evening as she came home brimming with stories of her successes, her eyes shone again with that spark of life I thought she had lost forever. For me, that glow was the greatest reward of all the battles we had fought. One afternoon, Mr. Harris stopped by for coffee. It was then he told us that Richard, thanks to his own recorded words and the forged papers he had signed in that bank meeting, had been sentenced to a considerable prison term for attempted fraud. Neither Alice nor I celebrated. We felt only a quiet relief, as though the last handful of earth had finally been laid upon a dark chapter now buried for good. That winter, as the snow fell and the fire crackled, Alice turned to me and said softly, "I'm glad we never sold this house, Mom. It's our fortress." In that moment, I understood that these bricks and beams were more than shelter. This was the last sanctuary of our family, the stronghold of memories Richard had tried to destroy. Defending it had been the truest thing I could ever have done. Life had shown me that sometimes the flowers you love most wither even in the soil you trust most. Yet a mother's love and patience holds the power to make them bloom again, even amidst ruins. Sometimes, to protect a family, you must first let it break. And that is a lesson I learned through bitter but unshakable wisdom. A year after the great storm, the house no longer echoed with grief or betrayal. Instead, every corner bore witness to the fragile but hopeful laughter and new dreams Alice and I had planted together. One evening, she came to me with a letter in her hand. Thanks to her hard work, she had been offered a managerial position in another city, an opportunity she had always dreamed of. Yet she hesitated, torn by the thought of leaving me alone in this great house. At that moment, I saw how far she had come, how high she was now ready to fly on her own wings. Swallowing the instinct to say, "Stay," I told her this home was never her cage, only her refuge,
that she could always return here. But my greatest joy would be seeing her pursue her dreams without fear. For a mother's duty is not to cling, but to set her child free, even at the cost of her own loneliness. As the days filled with the sweet chaos of her preparations, I felt the old ache of impending silence creep back into my chest. But this time, I knew it would not be the silence of mourning or captivity. It would be the quiet dignity of a mother who had prepared her child to face the world stronger than ever before. And so, on the day I kissed my daughter goodbye, through tears and smiles, and closed the door behind her, I returned to the stillness of this house. It was then I realized the battle I had fought was never truly about saving bricks or mortar. It had always been about giving a wounded bird back its wings so it might find its own sky again. And in that, I had won the greatest victory of all.
The deep silence that settled over my home after my daughter left at first reminded me of the bitter loneliness I had felt after my late husband's passing. Yet, as time passed, I came to understand that this new quiet was not the mourning of a widow, but the peaceful refuge of someone who had survived life's greatest storm and now wished only to listen to her own soul. For years, I had lived only as a mother and grandmother, forgetting the self that once delighted in painting and found joy in tending a garden. So when I brought down the old easel from the attic and decided, with Mr. Harris's wife, to enroll in the little pottery class held at the community center, it felt as though I was stepping into the springtime of a second life. One morning, when the postman delivered a surprise from Alice, a sleek, modern computer, and her smiling face appeared on the screen as though she were sitting in my very parlor, I marveled at how distance no longer mattered. Technology, I realized with astonishment and joy, can perform miracles when love is present. When I began volunteering at the small charity in our parish, offering fresh produce from my garden and jars of jam made with recipes handed down from my own mother, I discovered the unique joy of giving. I realized that true living is not only caring for one's own family, but adding a touch of kindness to every life one can reach. Now in the evenings, sitting in that tranquil quiet and breathing in the scent of jasmine drifting from the garden while watching the sun sink below the horizon, I know that the house I fought to protect is not merely bricks and mortar. It is the sacred place where Alice and I rose from the ashes and rediscovered both life and ourselves. And it has taught me that the greatest wealth of all is peace. Years passed. The dark memories of the past faded almost to nothing, when one morning I found a letter in the postbox. I recognized instantly the trembling handwriting of Richard's mother. Like a drop of poison falling upon a wound I believed healed, it stirred a familiar anxiety in my chest. Yet, when I opened it, I did not find reproach or anger. Instead, it was a mother's plea for forgiveness for a son soon to be released from prison, her words heavy with shame and sorrow. It was the desperate cry of a broken heart, and in reading it, the last embers of anger within me were quietly extinguished. That evening, during a video call with Alice, I told her about the letter.
She was no longer the fragile girl who had once been deceived, but a woman hardened and strengthened by life's blows. "That chapter is closed, Mum," she said firmly. "For me, there is no forgiveness, but no hatred either. Only nothingness. Whatever you choose, I'll stand beside you." Her words showed me once again how strong she had become. For days I pondered the meaning of forgiveness, realizing that holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting another to suffer. In the end, I understood that my task was not to absolve Richard, nor to welcome him back into my life, but to release, once and for all, the last shadow of his ghost that lingered in my soul, for my own peace. In the brief reply I penned to his mother, I mentioned neither her son nor the pain he had caused. I wrote only, "As a mother, I understand your sorrow, and I hope one day you too may find peace." As I sealed the envelope and sent it on its way, I knew that I was not merely posting a kind sentiment. I was releasing the final chain that bound me. And in that moment, I felt truly, utterly free.
In one of those peaceful years, during what seemed like an ordinary video call with my daughter, she turned to me with sparkling eyes and a trembling voice filled with joy and told me that I was going to be a grandmother. In that instant, it felt as though every tear I had shed, every sorrow I had endured, had been repaid by fate with the sweetest and most precious gift I could ever imagine. When Alice, still haunted by her past, asked me, "What if I'm not a good mother?" I reminded her not only of my own experiences, but of the strength she had shown in surviving the fiercest storms of her life. I told her that the greatest gift a child could ever receive was not a flawless mother, but one who never gave up, who loved with all her heart, and who always stood firm no matter what. Months later, in a hospital room far from home, I held my grandson in my arms for the very first time. Breathing in that heavenly scent after so many years, I felt in my very bones that this tiny being was not only a new life, but also the purest and most tangible proof that our family, once broken, was healing, that hope had risen from the ashes. When Alice turned to me in that tender silence and told me that they had given her son the name of my late husband, Michael, the faithful, kind, and loving companion of my life, I knew the warm tears streaming down my face were both a reflection of my deep longing for the past and the indescribable hope that was blossoming within me for the future. After spending dreamlike weeks with my daughter and grandson, returning at last to my quiet but peaceful home, I realized that I now lived not only for myself, but also for that vibrant new life I would visit so often. And I understood that my house, once simply a fortress, had become the heart of a family with roots strong and branches stretching far into the future. Recently, I decided to have repaired the old clock that once bore witness to our most painful truths. Now, I wanted it to mark not betrayal, but the new days of peace we had reached, to chime in harmony with the laughter of my grandson filling these rooms. As I walked through the garden I had tended with so much care, I understood that life itself is much like this soil,
Sometimes storms strike down your most beloved flowers. Sometimes poisonous weeds smother the fertile ground. But if you are patient enough to clear away the weeds and prune the broken branches, life will always reward you with blossoms more beautiful than before. When I think back to Richard's greed and the wicked plans built upon the monetary value of this house, I see more clearly than ever what true wealth is. My fortune is not these walls. It is the love sheltered within them, Alice's rediscovered happiness, and my grandson's innocent smile. To ensure that none of these struggles or sorrows would simply vanish into the wind, I wrote a letter for the little boy who would one day grow up, my grandson. In it, there is not a single word about betrayal or cruelty, but only a story of how strong his mother had been, how love overcomes every hardship, and how a person's greatest fortress is their own conscience. Now, as the mended clock ticks peacefully and I watch my grandson's gentle breathing on the screen beside me, I understand that although life once revealed its most merciless face to me, I have reached, through patient endurance for those I love, the most precious treasure a human being can ever hope for: serenity after the storm, and that priceless wealth we call inner peace.